The bottle was brown glass, about the size of a thumb. The label was printed in gentle script, with small illustrations of flowers along the border. It said, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, recommended for children teething. It was 1883. The mother read the label. She spooned the liquid into her child's mouth, the way the pharmacist had told her to, the way her neighbor had told her to, the way her own mother had told her before that. The child stopped crying. It always stopped crying. The bottle was empty by Tuesday. She didn't know she was giving her child morphine. Nobody did. That was more or less the point. What she held in her hand was not medicine in the way we understand the word today. It was something older. A promise, sealed inside glass, that whatever was hurting would stop hurting. And it worked. It worked every time. It worked until it didn't. And by the time anyone understood what was actually in it, an entire generation had been quietly, systematically, invisibly addicted to something they had no name for. Tonight, we are going to climb a ladder. It begins with the most ordinary things. The tablets in your bathroom cabinet, the little white pills that cost less than a cup of tea, and that almost everyone has taken without a second thought. And it ends somewhere considerably darker. Somewhere the chemistry becomes indistinguishable from execution. The distance between those two places is not a moral distance. It is not the distance between weak people and strong people, between the careful and the reckless, between the guilty and the innocent. It is a chemical distance, measured in milligrams, in receptor affinity, in the precise, merciless speed at which a human brain decides it cannot function without what it has been given. This is the complete history of painkillers, ranked from the weakest to the most hopelessly addictive. And almost nothing on this list started as a drug of abuse. Almost everything started as a solution. That is perhaps the most important thing to hold in your mind before we begin. Before we go any further, if these quiet, unhurried histories help you rest, consider leaving a like or subscribe before you close your eyes tonight. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. Somehow, it is always 2 in the morning somewhere. And that, quietly, is why this channel exists. Now, let us start at the very bottom of the ladder. The bottom of the ladder is a tree. Specifically, it is a willow. A tree so common, so unremarkable, that it grows along the banks of rivers on almost every continent on earth. It weeps, it bends, and for approximately 4,000 years, it was the closest thing humanity had to a painkiller. The Sumerians recorded it first. Clay tablets from around 4000 BCE described the willow's bark being used for pain and fever. The Egyptians knew it. The Assyrians included it in their medical texts. Hippocrates, the Greek physician whose name is still invoked when doctors take their oaths, prescribed a bitter tea brewed from willow leaves for headaches and for the pain of childbirth. None of them knew why it worked. They only knew that it did, and that was, for most of human history, entirely sufficient. What they were giving their patients was salicin, a compound bound tightly within the fibrous tissue of the bark, released slowly when chewed or boiled, converted by the body into salicylic acid, which reduced fever and suppressed pain by mechanisms that would not be understood for another 2,000 years. The tree had been quietly practicing medicine for longer than any physician had been alive. It had no degree, asked no questions, and charged nothing. There is something worth sitting with in that, The oldest painkiller in human history grew in the ground. You could pull it from the riverbank, strip the bark, chew it down to fiber, and the pain would not vanish but recede, become something you could bear. The body, presented with salicin, knew exactly what to do. The first real step toward the aspirin we recognize today came in 1763, when an English clergyman named Edward Stone wrote a letter to the Royal Society. He had been experimenting with dried willow bark for 5 years, administering it to patients with fevers, and he had found it consistently effective. His theory for why it worked was charmingly wrong. He believed the willow grew in damp places. Damp places caused fevers, therefore the cure lived near the cause. He was entirely mistaken about the mechanism. He was entirely correct about the outcome. Real chemistry followed in the decades after Stone's letter. In 1828, Johann Büchner, a professor at the University of Munich, extracted what he called salicin from willow bark, bitter yellow crystals that shimmered faintly in the light and tasted of pure astringency. A year later, Henri Leroux in France refined the process further, isolating a purer crystalline form and using it to treat rheumatism. Then, in 1838, the Italian chemist Raffaele Peria converted salicin into salicylic acid, more potent, more precisely targeted, and significantly more destructive to the stomach of anyone who took it. Patients who treated their joint pain with salicylic acid frequently found themselves with a second, more urgent problem: gastric bleeding, cramping, a burning sensation that reminded them unpleasantly that the stomach is not a device designed to absorb acid. For 40 years, no one could resolve this contradiction. The compound worked. The compound also caused suffering of its own. And then, in 1897, a chemist at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Germany added a single chemical modification that changed everything. His name was Felix Hoffman. His father had rheumatism. His father also had a stomach that couldn't tolerate the salicylic acid used to treat the rheumatism. Hoffman searched for a way to buffer the compound, to soften its edges without dulling its effect. He added an acetyl group to the salicylic acid molecule, creating acetylsalicylic acid, a compound that in the stomach was gentler and in the bloodstream performed all the functions of its predecessor. Bayer named the new drug aspirin. The name came from the A of acetyl and the sprin of spirea, the meadowsweet shrub that was an alternative botanical source of the same active molecule. Aspirin entered the market in 1899 and within a decade was being produced in tablet form, becoming what it remains today, one of the most widely used pharmaceutical compounds in human history. There is a footnote to this story that matters. 11 days after Felix Hoffman synthesized aspirin, records suggest that the same chemist synthesized something else in the same Bayer laboratory. Something that would also receive a brand name, also be marketed as safer than whatever came before it, and also reshape the world in ways nobody anticipated. We will reach that compound in a later tier. For now, simply note that aspirin and that other molecule were born 11 days apart in the same building, from the same mind. Aspirin was, by any reasonable measure, a triumph. It reduced fever without opiates. It controlled inflammation without resorting to anything stronger than what the willow tree had always offered, just more precisely, more reliably, at lower doses, without the bark. It gave millions of people a way through a headache, a fever, a sprain, a bout of flu that did not involve anything that altered their minds or enslaved their bodies. And it is not harmless. That is the first deception. Aspirin works by inhibiting an enzyme called cyclooxygenase, COX, in clinical shorthand, which is responsible for producing prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are chemical messengers that do several things simultaneously. They sensitize nerve endings to pain. They trigger fever. They cause the characteristic swelling of inflammation. And they maintain the protective mucus lining of the stomach. Aspirin suppresses the prostaglandins that cause pain. It also suppresses the prostaglandins that protect the stomach from its own acid. You cannot separate these functions cleanly. The same enzyme does both jobs. Regular aspirin users develop gastric irritation, ulcers, and in severe cases, gastrointestinal bleeding at measurable documented rates. Long-term use thins the blood, useful in preventing heart attacks, dangerous in any context where bleeding is a risk. In children, aspirin combined with a viral infection has been causally linked to Reyes syndrome, a catastrophic, rapidly progressing swelling of the brain and liver that can move from symptom to death within days. This is why aspirin is no longer given to children with fevers. That recommendation was not formally established until the early 1980s, after enough cases had accumulated to make the pattern impossible to dismiss. But aspirin, even with its shadows, is almost gentle compared to the second drug in this tier, the compound that sits in virtually every medicine cabinet in the Western world. The thing people reach for reflexively, without reading the label, without calculating the dose, without any particular anxiety about consequences. Paracetamol, called acetaminophen in the United States, sold as Panadol in the United Kingdom, as Tylenol in North America, as Calpol in formulations for children, under dozens of additional brand names in dozens of additional countries, dosed into billions of human bodies every year, perhaps the single most frequently consumed pharmaceutical compound on Earth. It came to market in the United Kingdom in 1956, sold as Panadol, positioned as the intelligent alternative to aspirin. No stomach damage, no gastric risk, effective against pain and fever, suitable for the whole family including children. Within a decade, 680 million units per year were being sold in Britain alone. It spread through the rest of the developed world at similar speed, embedding itself so thoroughly in the pharmacology of daily life that most people today cannot imagine the medicine cabinet without it. What almost no one was told, what was, in fact, not confirmed until 1966, a full decade after the drug entered widespread use, was that paracetamol, when taken in overdose, destroys the liver. Not gradually, not partially, destroys it. The liver necrosis it produces is acute, specific, centrilobular, targeting the most metabolically active cells first, and it is delayed in a way that makes it particularly dangerous. A person who takes too much paracetamol on a Monday may feel entirely well on Tuesday. They may feel a mild nausea on Wednesday. By Thursday, their liver enzymes are catastrophic. By the weekend, without intervention, they may require a transplant, or they may not survive. The mechanism is precise and worth understanding because it is one of those instances where biology is both elegant and brutal. The body processes paracetamol through the liver, converting most of it into harmless compounds that the kidneys then excrete without incident. But a fraction, processed by a specific set of liver enzymes called the cytochrome P450 system, is converted instead into a compound called NAPQI, N-acetyl P-benzoquinone imine. NAPQI is reactive unstable, and highly toxic to liver cells. Under normal conditions, the liver neutralizes it almost instantly using a molecule called glutathione, an antioxidant that binds to the NAPQG before it can cause damage. Glutathione is, in this context, the liver's own internal fire suppression system. Take a standard dose of paracetamol, and the system works exactly as intended. The NAPQI is neutralized. The glutathione does its job, and nothing harmful accumulates. Take too much, or take a standard dose in a body that is already low on glutathione due to fasting, malnutrition, chronic alcohol use, or certain genetic variations, and the system fails. The NAPQI production outpaces the available glutathione. The fire suppression system runs dry, and the NAPQI, uncontrolled, begins attacking liver proteins directly, binding covalently to cellular structures and triggering a cascade of oxidative damage and cell death that, once it reaches a critical threshold, becomes self-sustaining and irreversible. The recommended maximum daily dose for a healthy adult is 4 grams, 8 standard tablets. That sounds like considerable headroom. It is not always considerable headroom. The margin narrows if you have been fasting. It narrows if you are malnourished. It narrows significantly with regular alcohol consumption because alcohol induces the same cytochrome P450 enzymes that produce NAPQI, accelerating its formation. And, crucially, it narrows if you are taking multiple products that each contain paracetamol, which is common and often invisible, because paracetamol is an ingredient in dozens of cold and flu remedies, combination painkillers, and nighttime formulas that do not necessarily advertise the fact on their front labels. People have died from the combined paracetamol in 2 products that seemed, individually, entirely benign. Paracetamol is today the leading cause of acute liver failure in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Not heroin, not fentanyl, not any of the drugs that will occupy the later tiers of this ranking. The drug in your kitchen drawer, the one you take without water sometimes, the one you give your children when they have a temperature. This drug accounts for more acute liver failures than any other substance in 2 of the world's most medically sophisticated countries. That is not a cause for panic. Paracetamol, taken within its recommended doses, is safe. It is effective. It has spared an incalculable amount of suffering across a century of use. The deception is not in the molecule. The deception is in the relationship, in the deep cultural assumption that something sold without prescription, something so ordinary and small and familiar, could not carry a danger that required serious attention. We do not read the label on paracetamol the way we read the label on things we consider dangerous, and that casual blindness, replicated billions of times, is itself a kind of pharmacological risk. Ibuprofen, the 3rd member of this opening tier, belongs to the same broad family as aspirin, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs, and operates through the same fundamental mechanism: inhibition of cyclooxygenase, suppression of prostaglandins, reduction of inflammation and pain. It is somewhat more targeted than aspirin in its COX inhibition, somewhat gentler on the stomach in the short term, and broadly effective for the kinds of pain that have an inflammatory component: muscle soreness, joint pain, dental pain, menstrual cramps, post-surgical recovery. For most people, taking ibuprofen occasionally for a sore back or a headache carries minimal risk. But the prostaglandins that ibuprofen suppresses are not only involved in inflammation. In the kidneys, prostaglandins play a direct role in regulating blood flow to the organ's filtration system. Suppress them chronically, as happens with long-term regular ibuprofen use, and the kidneys begin to receive insufficient blood flow. The result, over time, is impaired kidney function and, in vulnerable patients, acute kidney injury. The same mechanism also elevates blood pressure and increases the risk of cardiovascular events in patients who are already at risk. The anti-inflammatory, applied incorrectly to the wrong patient in the wrong dose for the wrong duration, becomes a slow assault on the organs it was never meant to touch. What unites these three drugs, aspirin, paracetamol, ibuprofen, is not their mechanism, not their chemistry, not their history. What unites them is something subtler and more important. They are the only tier on this entire ranking that has genuinely no addiction potential. They do not touch the brain's reward circuitry. They do not produce euphoria, dependence, or withdrawal. They do not, in any meaningful sense, want anything from the person who takes them. And yet they carry their own quiet dangers, dangers disguised by ordinariness, dangers that accumulate in the gap between what we assume about familiar things and what is actually true. The Tier 1 drugs are called the Deceivers, not because they deceive us about their effects, but because they deceive us about their nature. They look like nothing. They feel like nothing. Most of the time, they are nothing much at all. But sit with this for a moment. The world's most commonly consumed painkiller is the leading cause of liver failure in the world's most medically advanced countries, and the most ancient painkiller in human history, the one that grew from the earth before we had cities, caused stomach bleeds and brain damage in children before we understood it well enough to know it could. If this is what the bottom of the ladder looks like, quiet, ordinary, familiar, and quietly treacherous, then the question that carries you forward into the night is a simple one. What does the next rung look like? The answer is the poppy. And with the poppy, everything changes. The poppy does not look like a drug. That is the first thing worth saying about it. It is a flower. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, blooms in shades of white and pale violet and deep arterial red, and it grows in thin, chalky soils across Asia and the Mediterranean, with an ease that suggests it was designed to be found. Ancient peoples found it. The Sumerians called it hulgil, the plant of joy, and they were cultivating it in Lower Mesopotamia around 3400 BCE, which makes it one of the oldest cultivated plants in human history. Not for food, not for fiber, for what it did to the person who consumed it. The juice of the unripe seed pod, dried in the air until it darkened to a gummy brown resin, contained something that the human nervous system recognized as more important than almost anything else in its environment. Something that did not just reduce pain, but replaced it. Something that did not just quiet the alarm, but dismantled the alarm system entirely and replaced it with warmth and stillness and the specific absence of suffering that people who have spent their lives in pain describe as feeling for the first time like a human being. Opium, the raw resin, the original. It moved west through trade routes and armies, through physicians and merchants who recognized its value even when they could not explain it. The ancient Egyptians recorded it. The ancient Greeks used it. The Roman physician Galen prescribed it for almost everything: pain, insomnia, cough, diarrhea. He was not wrong about its effectiveness. He was simply not thinking about what happened when it was taken away. For most of human history, that question was not asked with urgency. the concept of addiction as a physiological process, as a condition in which the body remakes itself around a substance and cannot function without it, did not exist in the ancient world. Some people came back for the poppy more than others. This was noted. It was not considered a crisis. The substance worked. People wanted it. That was the transaction. The first attempt to make opium more portable, more standardized, and more socially acceptable came in the 16th century from a Swiss-German alchemist who went by the name Paracelsus. He was one of the first people to argue that chemistry, not astrology, should form the basis of medical treatment. Brilliant, difficult, and deeply strange. And sometime in the 1500s, he created a preparation of opium dissolved in alcohol that he called laudanum. The name came from the Latin laudare, to praise. He named an opiate tincture something to be praised. That tells you a great deal about how the 16th century understood what it had made. The preparation Paracelsus made was not quite what would later carry the name laudanum. His recipe included other ingredients, pearls, gold, various additions that owed more to alchemy than to pharmacology. It was Thomas Sydenham, the 17th century English physician, known as the father of clinical medicine, who in 1660 created the standardized version that would define the drug for the next 2.5 centuries. Sydenham's laudanum was, in essence, opium powder dissolved in alcohol, with a small quantity of saffron and other flavoring agents to make it more palatable. Around 10% opium by weight, up to 50% alcohol. A reddish-brown liquid, extremely bitter, that contained within its small volume nearly every alkaloid in the opium poppy. Morphine, codeine, thebaine, suspended in a medium that ensured they were absorbed rapidly and completely. Sydenham called it his greatest achievement. He was not alone in that assessment. Over the next 2 centuries, laudanum became the most prescribed substance in the Western world. The reason for this was not complicated. Laudanum worked with a speed and completeness that nothing else in the Victorian medical arsenal could approach. It reached the bloodstream quickly, crossed the blood-brain barrier within minutes, and bound to the opioid receptors that evolution had placed there for the body's own internal painkillers. The poppy alkaloids slotted into those receptors like keys into locks. They fit perfectly because the locks had always been there, waiting. The brain's reward circuitry responded with a warmth and a cessation of distress so complete that patients often described it in almost spiritual terms. Not just the absence of pain, the presence of peace, the feeling of being, for perhaps the first time, exactly where they were supposed to be. This, more than any other fact, explains why laudanum spread so thoroughly and so quickly. It was not merely effective. It was the most effective thing anyone had ever taken. It is difficult to convey, from the vantage point of our current pharmaceutical landscape, how completely laudanum saturated Victorian life. It was not a fringe substance. It was not something associated with the disreputable or the desperate. It was medicine. It was the medicine. A Victorian household without laudanum was as unusual as a modern household without paracetamol, and the conditions for which it was prescribed made paracetamol's range seem narrow by comparison. Laudanum was given for headaches and toothaches, for coughs and for diarrhea, for menstrual pain and for rheumatism, for anxiety and for sleeplessness, and for what Victorian physicians called nervous complaints, a category so broad it could encompass almost anything a woman might suffer from that a doctor did not know how to treat otherwise. It was given to children. This is the part that requires a moment of stillness. Victorian mothers gave laudanum to teething infants, to colicky babies, to children who would not sleep. The soothing syrups and the quietness drops, and the nurse's friend, the branded preparations that lined the shelves of every Victorian pharmacist and grocer and tobacconist. Many of them contained laudanum. Some, like the Mrs. Winslow's preparation we began with tonight, contained morphine directly. The dosing instructions were vague. The manufacturers were not regulated. Children died. Not frequently enough to create scandal, but frequently enough that if you look at Victorian infant mortality records with modern eyes and modern knowledge, you begin to understand some of what you are seeing differently. The Victorian medical establishment was not, by its own standards, reckless in prescribing laudanum. It was operating within the best understanding available, which was that laudanum was effective, that it relieved suffering, and that the alternative was often to leave patients in conditions far more immediately dangerous than the drug itself. Dysentery, one of the great killers of the era, could be controlled with laudanum. Cholera's lethal diarrhea could be slowed by opium's constipating effect. Tuberculosis, which killed an estimated 1 in 4 Europeans at its peak, had no cure. The cough could be suppressed, the pain of breathing made bearable, the final weeks made less terrible, with laudanum. Victorian physicians were not administering a drug of abuse. They were managing suffering in a world where suffering had very few other managers. 20 or 25 drops of laudanum could be purchased for a penny. It was cheaper than alcohol. It was available without prescription, without consultation, without any of the apparatus we now associate with controlled substances. You could buy it from the grocer, the tobacconist, the barber, the confectioner. You could mail order it. You could give it to yourself, to your children, to your household servants, to keep them productive, to your aging parents, to keep them quiet. It was a currency of comfort in a century that had very little other currency to offer for the range of suffering that Victorian life produced. The artists used it too, but the artists are not the most important part of this story. They are the visible part, the documented part, which is not the same thing. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, admitted in an 1814 letter that he had been addicted to laudanum for years, beginning when he took it for the pain of rheumatic swellings in his knees. He described the habit as something he had been seduced into ignorantly, which is precisely the right word. Ada Lovelace, daughter of Byron, mathematical pioneer, the person widely credited as the world's first computer programmer, became dependent on laudanum prescribed for the uterine cancer that would kill her at 36. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took it for the lung condition and nervous complaints that had confined her to a sofa for years. Thomas de Quincey wrote an entire autobiography of his opium use, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and it was received not with horror, but with fascination and a degree of admiration, because in 1821, opium eating was not yet a disgrace. It was an experience, a dangerous one perhaps, but one that seemed to belong to a certain kind of literary and intellectual sensibility. The withdrawal from laudanum was described in Victorian medical literature in language that sounds, with modern ears, entirely contemporary. Sweating, trembling, muscle cramps, an overwhelming restlessness that made stillness impossible, a nausea so profound that patients could not eat, a psychological distress so acute that some described it as a disintegration of the self. Physicians knew this happened. They had observed it. And yet the prescribing continued, because withdrawal was treated as a separate problem, to be managed with more laudanum, or with willpower, or with the moral fortitude the Victorian era considered sufficient response to most forms of human difficulty. But the famous names are a distraction from the real story, which is the one without names. The working-class woman in Manchester, taking laudanum for the pain of factory work and the exhaustion of nursing multiple children through diseases that had no other treatment. The dock worker in Liverpool, whose back had been damaged by cargo, and whose doctor prescribed laudanum for the pain, and whose body, over months, made the adjustment that bodies always make to opiates, requiring more of it for the same relief, requiring some of it simply to function. The unnamed millions for whom laudanum was not a bohemian experiment, but a daily pharmaceutical necessity, embedded in their physiology so completely that stopping was not a choice their bodies would cooperate with. This is the first addiction epidemic in modern Western history. It has no official name. It appears in no mortality statistics as such, because there was no diagnostic category for it, no language for what had happened to the body, no framework through which it could be recognized as a public health phenomenon. It was simply the condition of the Victorian age, a vast, invisible dependency on a substance that had been prescribed, purchased, and consumed in such quantities that it had become part of the metabolic landscape of an entire civilization. And nested within laudanum, smaller and quieter, was the drug that occupies the other half of this tier, codeine, named from the Greek kodia, meaning poppy head. Isolated in 1832 by the French chemist Pierre Robiquet from the same opium extract that contained morphine, codeine is the second most abundant alkaloid in the opium poppy, the one that is still present in laudanum, the one that is still prescribed today, the one that sits in cough syrups and mild prescription painkillers in virtually every country on earth. It presents itself as the responsible face of the opium family, the mild one, the manageable one. Codeine is to morphine what a glass of wine is to grain alcohol. Still very much the same substance, still capable of the same essential action, but diluted, softened, positioned as appropriate for contexts where the full-strength version would be considered excessive. The body is not deceived by this positioning. When codeine is absorbed through the gut and processed by the liver, a specific enzyme, CYP2D6, for those who find the clinical detail helpful, converts a portion of it directly into morphine. This is not a metaphor. Codeine is a prodrug, a substance that the body converts into its active form after ingestion. That active form is morphine. A codeine tablet is, in the most literal pharmacological sense, a diluted morphine delivery system in different packaging. The mildness is a function of the conversion ratio. Approximately 10% of the codeine dose becomes morphine, not a function of any fundamental difference in the mechanism. What this means is that codeine's addiction potential is not theoretical. It is real, it is documented, and it follows the same pattern as every other opioid we will encounter in the higher tiers. Tolerance builds, dependence develops. Withdrawal is real and physically miserable. And the person who has been taking codeine for their cough for 6 months may find, when they try to stop, that the experience feels considerably more consequential than they expected from something so mild. There is also a complication of genetics. The enzyme CYP2D6 varies considerably between individuals. Some people are poor metabolizers. They convert very little codeine to morphine, and the drug barely works for them. Others are ultra-rapid metabolizers. They convert it with such efficiency that a standard dose delivers a morphine load capable of causing respiratory depression. Several children have died from codeine prescribed after tonsillectomies for precisely this reason. Their bodies were simply too efficient at doing what the drug was designed to do. The Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, passed in the United States after decades of growing awareness that the country had a drug problem of significant scale, required anyone who sold or distributed narcotics to register with the federal government. It began the process of transforming opium derivatives from everyday household commodities into regulated, accountable substances. It was the legal acknowledgement of something pharmacologically obvious for decades, that a civilization had built a dependency into itself at scale without ever meaning to. Britain arrived at similar conclusions around the same period. The era of buying laudanum as casually as buying bread was ending. The Victorian elixirs were being reclassified, restricted, moved behind counters, then behind prescriptions, then behind the careful monitored dispensing we now associate with controlled substances. But here is what the regulation could not do. It could not undo the physiology. The millions of bodies that had been shaped by years of laudanum did not rearrange themselves because a law had passed. The dependency persisted in those bodies. The withdrawal continued to be real. And the pharmaceutical industry, watching this transition, observed that the market for pain relief had not contracted simply because laudanum was becoming harder to obtain. It had simply become a market with an unfilled need, and the pharmaceutical industry had a policy, as yet unwritten but deeply operational, about unfilled needs. It filled them. And what it reached for next, in its confidence that chemistry could always find a safer solution, was something it called the synthetics. Compounds designed in laboratories, not extracted from plants. Molecules engineered with precision for the specific purpose of relieving pain without the messy, legally complicated problem of addiction. They were very confident about this. The science was new, the compounds were new, and this time the solution would not create a worse problem than the one it solved. They were wrong. They were wrong in ways that would take decades to become undeniable, and that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But that belongs to Tier 3. There is a phrase that recurs, with remarkable consistency, throughout the history of pharmaceutical development. It appears in patent applications and in congressional testimony, in medical journal abstracts, and in sales presentations given to general practitioners in hotel conference rooms on Thursday evenings in 1997. The phrase is non-addictive substitute, non-addictive substitute for opium, non-addictive substitute for morphine, non-addictive substitute for heroin, non-addictive substitute for the previous non-addictive substitute, which turned out, on reflection, to have been somewhat addictive after all. The pharmaceutical industry has been searching for the non-addictive substitute for approximately 2 centuries. It has not found it. What it has found, repeatedly, at regular intervals, with a consistency that would be almost impressive if the consequences were not quite so catastrophic, is drugs that appear non-addictive until they are prescribed broadly enough, for long enough, to reveal that they are not. Tier 3 is the story of that search in the 20th century. It is the story of 3 drugs that were, each in their own way, introduced to the world as the responsible choice, the manageable option, the one that had learned from the mistakes of what came before. Tramadol came first, in the logic of this tier, if not entirely in chronological order. It was synthesized in 1962 by the German pharmaceutical company Grünenthal, GmbH, a company whose name you may recognize if you know your pharmaceutical history, as the manufacturer of thalidomide. Thalidomide was the sedative prescribed to pregnant women in the late 1950s and early 1960s that caused severe birth defects in thousands of children before it was withdrawn. Grunenthal, having survived that particular episode, turned its attention to pain relief. They developed Tramadol quietly, tested it for 15 years in Germany before releasing it under the name Tramadol in 1977, and positioned it as something genuinely different from the opioids that had preceded it. They were not technically wrong about this. Tramadol is genuinely different. The difference is what makes it strange. Before we go further with Tramadol's pharmacology, it is worth pausing on that detail about 15 years of testing in Germany before the drug was released internationally. 15 years is a long time. It suggests caution. It suggests the kind of methodical, careful evaluation that the thalidomide disaster had made mandatory for any pharmaceutical company that wished to continue existing. And in a narrow technical sense, the testing was thorough. Grunenthal knew what Tramadol did at the receptor level. They knew its opioid binding characteristics. They knew its monoaminergic activity. What the 15 years of German clinical data could not easily predict was how the drug would behave once it was dispensed without the careful monitoring of a clinical trial. Once it reached the chronic pain patient taking it daily for months. The patient also on an antidepressant for depression. The patient who did not know to report changes in mood or unusual sensations because nobody had told them those changes might be relevant. A traditional opioid, morphine, codeine, OxyContin, works primarily by binding to the mu opioid receptor in the brain and spinal cord. Bind to the mu receptor with sufficient affinity and you block the pain signals traveling up the spinal cord. You activate the brain's reward system. You slow the breathing. You produce constipation. The mu receptor is the switch. Most opioids are essentially keys designed to turn that switch. Tramadol is a weak key. Its affinity for the mu opioid receptor is approximately 6,000 times less than that of morphine. 6,000 times. In pure opioid terms, Tramadol is barely registering. If mu receptor binding were the only thing Tramadol did, it would be a minor analgesic at best, and the question of its addiction potential would be largely theoretical. But Tramadol does something else, something that the engineers at Grunenthal had built in deliberately as part of its design. It inhibits the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine, the same neurotransmitters targeted by antidepressants like venlafaxine and duloxetine. This dual action, opioid and monoaminergic, gives Tramadol an analgesic effect considerably stronger than its opioid binding alone would suggest. The serotonergic component amplifies the pain relief. It also produces, in some patients, a mild euphoria and sociability that they do not associate with the drug because no one has told them that a painkiller might also make them feel more emotionally open. They simply feel better. They feel, in ways they struggle to articulate, more like themselves. And then they try to stop. Tramadol withdrawal is two withdrawals simultaneously. There is the opioid withdrawal, the restlessness, the sweating, the muscle cramps, the insomnia, the relentless physical discomfort that characterizes cessation of any opioid, even a weak one. And beneath it or alongside it, there is the antidepressant withdrawal, the anxiety, the vertigo, the strange electrical sensations that patients describe as brain zaps, the emotional flatness, the return of pain and low mood that makes the world seem both larger and less manageable than it did before the drug. two sets of receptors adjusting simultaneously, two distinct physiological processes of dependence unwinding at the same time. Physicians who prescribed Tramadol in the 1990s, after it received FDA approval in 1995, were frequently told it was not a controlled substance and did not carry significant addiction risk. The DEA did not classify it as a controlled substance until 2014. For nearly 2 decades, a drug with both opioid and antidepressant receptor activity was prescribed as freely as ibuprofen, without the scheduling restrictions or the careful patient monitoring that its pharmacology warranted. That is the specific tragedy of Tramadol. It was not a lie, exactly. Its opioid potency really is dramatically lower than traditional opioids. The problem was that the framing, non-addictive, safe, different, did not account for what it actually was. A drug with two distinct mechanisms of dependence, both of which the body would notice when the drug was removed. There is one other thing about Tramadol that deserves a moment of careful attention, and it is the most dangerous thing on this particular page of the pharmacopoeia. Tramadol, combined with other serotonergic drugs, antidepressants, particularly SSRIs and SNRIs, which are among the most commonly prescribed medications in the world, can cause serotonin syndrome. Serotonin syndrome is an excess of serotonergic activity in the nervous system that manifests as agitation, tremor, muscle rigidity, fever, rapid heart rate, and, in severe cases, seizures and death. The combination does not require high doses of either drug. Standard therapeutic doses of Tramadol combined with standard therapeutic doses of an SSRI antidepressant can, in susceptible individuals, trigger a potentially fatal interaction that neither prescriber may have considered, because the drugs were prescribed by different physicians, or because no one asked the right question at the right time. The drug designed to be safe was carrying a hidden condition. The condition was safe, unless combined with the other medication your GP prescribed you for depression, which, in the population of people who need chronic pain management, is an extremely common co-prescription. Vicodin and Percocet entered this story from a different angle, carrying different risks and a different kind of institutional history. Hydrocodone, the active opioid in Vicodin, is a semi-synthetic opioid derived from codeine. It was developed in the 1920s in Germany, the same country and roughly the same era that had already given the world morphine and heroin and the pharmaceutical infrastructure that would shape the next century of painkiller development. Hydrocodone was combined with acetaminophen to create Vicodin, a decision that deserves a moment of recognition for its particular architectural irony. The Tier 3 opioid was paired in its most common commercial formulation with the Tier 1 liver-destroying compound we discussed at the very beginning of this ranking. One tablet, two distinct damage pathways. The opioid hijacking the brain's reward system in one direction, the acetaminophen quietly approaching the liver's glutathione reserves in another. Percocet followed the same structural logic. OxyContin, synthesized in Germany in 1916, explicitly designed as a replacement for heroin, combined with acetaminophen. Slightly stronger than Vicodin. The same architectural decision. Opioid plus acetaminophen bound together in a single tablet that managed, in a remarkable feat of pharmaceutical economy, to carry the dependence risks of Tier 4 and the hepatotoxicity risks of Tier 1 in a single convenient formulation. By the mid-1970s, both drugs were on the American market. Physicians had been taught for decades to be cautious about prescribing opioids. The addictive nature of morphine and heroin was well understood. The medical consensus was that opioids were appropriate for acute pain, for post-surgical recovery, for cancer patients, for end-of-life care, contexts where the severity of the pain justified the risk of the drug. For chronic non-cancer pain, the standard of care was careful restraint. Then came the letter. On January 10th, 1980, the New England Journal of Medicine published a brief correspondence. Not a study, not a clinical trial, but 11 lines of text from Jane Porter and a physician named Dr. Herschel Jick. The letter described an analysis of records from 11,882 hospitalized patients who had been treated with narcotics. Their conclusion in its entirety: the development of addiction was rare in medical patients with no prior history of addiction. 4 cases of addiction had been identified among the 11,882 patients, less than 1%. The letter was not a study of chronic pain management. It was not an analysis of outpatient opioid use. It was not an examination of what happened to patients after they left the hospital and continued taking the medication at home. Without monitoring, without the clinical context that had shaped the inpatient experience, it was 11 lines describing hospitalized patients based on records that did not include follow-up data. Over the following 2 decades, that 11-line letter was cited more than 600 times in medical literature. It was cited in support of the argument that opioids could safely be prescribed for chronic pain. It was cited by pharmaceutical sales representatives in their conversations with general practitioners. It was cited in editorials, in guidelines, in the intellectual infrastructure that allowed a generation of physicians to feel that prescribing Vicodin and Percocet for chronic back pain, for arthritis, for fibromyalgia, for the broad spectrum of persistent pain that did not respond well to the Tier 1 drugs, was supported by evidence. The New England Journal of Medicine published a reassessment of that letter in 2017. The reassessment noted that the letter had described hospitalized patients only, not patients taking opioids at home. It noted that the 4 cases of addiction identified represented only the cases observed during hospitalization, not any follow-up. It noted that the letter had been misread, mischaracterized, and systematically misused to support conclusions that its data could not support. By 2017, it was too late for that reassessment to change very much. The prescribing had already happened. The prescriptions had already been filled. The bodies had already made the physiological adjustments that bodies always make to opioids, and the epidemic that those adjustments had seeded was already visible in the mortality data. Prescription opioid sales in the United States quadrupled between 1999 and 2010. During the same period, opioid overdose deaths doubled. The drugs responsible for the majority of that prescribing surge were not morphine and heroin. They were the Tier 3 drugs, Vicodin, Percocet, and their generic equivalents, filling a prescription gap that the 11-line letter had helped create through a pharmaceutical infrastructure that had decided on the basis of what turned out to be a misreading of inadequate data that the risk of addiction in non-cancer chronic pain patients was negligible. The withdrawal from hydrocodone and oxycodone is not subtle. It has been described in clinical literature with clinical precision, and the clinical precision does not diminish its severity. It begins 6 to 30 hours after the last dose, depending on whether the formulation was immediate release or extended release. The The symptoms in the first 2 to 3 days include muscle aches, insomnia, anxiety, sweating, and a restlessness so profound that patients describe being unable to remain still for more than a few minutes. The gastrointestinal symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramping, typically peak around the 3rd day. The psychological symptoms: anxiety, dysphoria, craving, the persistent sense that something essential is missing, can persist for weeks, sometimes months, in what clinicians call post-acute withdrawal syndrome. None of this, the patient who was prescribed Vicodin for their back pain in 2003 was told. None of this appeared in the package insert in language that communicated what it actually felt like. The risks were listed. The experience of the risks was not described. There is a particular cruelty to this omission that does not belong to any single actor in the chain. The physician who prescribed it did not experience the withdrawal. The pharmaceutical company that manufactured it did not experience the withdrawal. The researcher who wrote the 11-line letter did not experience the withdrawal. The patient alone, in the 3rd day of a process they had not been prepared for, discovered what the drug had been doing to them all along, not through any document or conversation or informed consent, but through the experience of its absence. The body makes the argument. Nobody else does. The synthetics did something that the Victorian Elixirs had not quite managed. Laudanum had addicted an era. Vicodin and Percocet addicted individuals, millions of specific, named individuals, each of whom had been given a prescription by a physician who had been given permission by an institution that had been given confidence by an 11-line letter, published 40 years earlier in a medical journal that everyone agreed was authoritative. The chain of permission is worth sitting with, because the chain did not end with Vicodin and Percocet. The chain was being prepared while this tier was still filling America's medicine cabinets for something considerably more deliberate. Something that was not a product of misread evidence or inadequate follow-up or the honest errors of a medical establishment operating with insufficient information. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. That is tier 4. And it begins with a company, a family, and a launch party, where the man at the podium asked his guests to imagine a blizzard. But before we climb to that rung, sit with what tier 3 revealed. 3 drugs, 3 distinct introductions into the market, across 3 decades, each one positioned as the responsible, safer, medically defensible option. Tramadol, the dual mechanism wonder with 2 withdrawal profiles hidden inside its mild exterior. Vicodin and Percocet, the everyday prescriptions that paired opioid dependence with hepatotoxicity in a single tablet. And beneath all of it, the 11-line letter, the piece of evidence so slender, so contextually limited, so thoroughly misread, that it becomes difficult to call it evidence at all. It was a note, a brief clinical observation about hospitalized patients, and it became the intellectual permission slip for a generation of prescribing. The synthetics did not create the opioid crisis alone. What they did was build the infrastructure for what came next. The habits, the prescribing patterns, the patient expectations, the medical culture that had been persuaded, slowly and with considerable institutional support, that opioids for chronic pain were a reasonable and manageable intervention. They prepared the ground, and in 1996, something was planted in it that would grow faster than anyone had accounted for. In the winter of 1804, in a small laboratory in Einbeck, Germany, a young pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner spent several months attempting to isolate the active principle of opium. He was 20 years old. He had no university degree, He worked mostly alone, heating and filtering and precipitating the dark resin of the poppy through processes he invented as he went. What he eventually extracted was a white crystalline substance of unusual purity and unusual power. He named it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, the god who shaped the visions of sleeping men, who moved through the night, delivering experiences that felt to the dreamer entirely real. Sir Turner chose the name well. He simply did not know at 20 which kind of dreams he was naming it after. The isolation of morphine was one of the most significant events in the history of medicine. It was the first time a medically active compound had been extracted in pure form from a plant. The first alkaloid ever isolated by a human chemist. Before morphine, physicians administered opium in its raw, unpredictable form. The strength of the dose varied with every batch, every source, every season. After morphine, they had something measurable, something consistent, something they could, in theory, control. Merck began commercial production of morphine in 1827. The drug spread through the medical establishment with the speed that effective things always travel, quickly, and with a confidence that outpaced the available evidence about its long-term effects. Physicians prescribed it for pain and for anxiety and for respiratory complaints and for what was then called consumption, the tuberculosis that was emptying European cities of their young adults at a rate that made almost any intervention feel justifiable. Then, in 1853, the hypodermic needle was invented. This changed everything. Oral morphine reaches the bloodstream slowly, filtered and moderated by the gut and the liver. Injected morphine bypasses those systems entirely. It moves directly into the blood and from the blood into the brain within seconds, binding to the mu-opioid receptors with a speed and completeness that oral administration could never match. The brain's reward circuitry, activated by the injected morphine before it has had time to mount any defensive response, registers the flood of binding as something closer to compulsion than comfort. The pleasure produced by injected morphine is not the pleasant relief of oral laudanum. It is something more commanding, something the body tends to remember with unusual vividness. The difference between oral and injected morphine is not simply a matter of speed. It is a matter of what the brain is permitted to do in response. When a drug arrives gradually, filtered through the gut, metabolized by the liver, appearing in the bloodstream as a slow rising tide, the brain has time to begin adjusting. The opioid receptors begin to down-regulate, reducing their sensitivity to accommodate the incoming signal. The homeostatic mechanisms that the brain uses to maintain balance have time to engage. The experience is effective, but it is mediated. There is a buffer between the chemistry and the full force of its impact. Inject morphine directly into the bloodstream, and that buffer disappears. The drug arrives in the brain faster than the brain can prepare for it. The mu-opioid receptors, unprepared and unadjusted, respond to the sudden flood of binding with an intensity that oral administration had never produced. What oral laudanum offered was relief. What injected morphine offered was something closer to the suspension of all difficulty. The absence, not just of pain, but of every competing signal the nervous system was generating. For soldiers lying in field hospitals in the winter of 1862, with wounds that would have been unsurvivable in any previous century, that suspension was indistinguishable from grace. The American Civil War provided the first large-scale, systematic test of injected morphine as a battlefield medicine. The scale of the injuries, amputations performed without anesthesia, gunshot wounds that shattered bone and left fragments that surgeons could not always retrieve, infections that spread through field hospitals that had no antibiotics and very little else, made morphine not a luxury, but a logistical necessity. Soldiers received it by injection on the field and in the hospitals. It controlled pain that would otherwise have been unsurvivable. It allowed surgeons to operate. It allowed the injured to rest and heal in conditions where rest and healing were otherwise impossible. It also, at the war's end, left an estimated 400,000 soldiers with a physiological dependency on the drug they had been given to survive. They went home to their families carrying something that had no name yet, that the medical literature had barely begun to describe, and that would define the rest of their lives in ways they could not have anticipated when they were lying in a field hospital in Virginia, having a Minier ball extracted from their femur. The phenomenon became known with the blunt descriptiveness of the era as the soldier's disease. The first named opioid epidemic in American history, it was, in every meaningful sense, a consequence of medicine doing its job correctly, of giving soldiers what they needed to survive, without yet having the knowledge to anticipate what survival would cost them afterward. The response from the pharmaceutical industry was the response that always follows the naming of a new problem, a search for a solution, a better compound, a more powerful molecule that could do what morphine did, kill pain, control symptoms, make the unbearable bearable, without doing what morphine also did, which was make the body dependent on its continued presence. Felix Hoffman at Bayer found what he believed was the answer in 1898. 11 days after synthesizing the aspirin we discussed in Tier 1, the same chemist, in the same laboratory, combined morphine with acetic acid and produced diacetylmorphine. The compound was not entirely new. It had been first synthesized in 1874 by an English chemist named Charles Alder Wright. But Hoffman's version was stable, and Bayer had the industrial infrastructure to manufacture it at scale, and the marketing department to position it precisely as the non-addictive substitute that the soldier's disease had made the medical world desperate for. Bayer named it heroin. The name came from the German heroisch, heroic. Strong medicines in the German pharmaceutical tradition of the era were described as heroic. The naming was not cynical. It was, in 1898, a straightforward description of what the company believed it had made. Heroin is approximately 1.5 to 2 times more potent than morphine by weight. That modest potency difference does not fully explain why heroin became, in the decades following its introduction, significantly more addictive than morphine in practice. The fuller explanation lies in chemistry. Heroin is more lipid-soluble than morphine. It crosses the blood-brain barrier faster, more completely, and with a speed that produces a more immediate and more intense activation of the reward system. The brain has less time to prepare. The impact is sharper. The memory the brain forms of that impact is correspondingly more compelling. Bayer marketed heroin as a cough suppressant and as a non-addictive treatment for morphine addiction. These were not disreputable claims in 1898. Morphine suppressed coughs, and heroin suppressed them more effectively. In the absence of clinical data on heroin's long-term addictive potential, the comparison to morphine seemed supportable. Bayer promoted heroin for use in children with respiratory infections. It was sold without prescription, available in pharmacies, and through mail-order catalogs. Parents gave it to children for coughs, the way parents in the previous generation had given laudanum for teething. Within a decade, the error was undeniable. Heroin addiction spread through the United States and Western Europe with the speed of something that had been given every institutional advantage: medical endorsement, pharmaceutical distribution, affordable pricing, and a patient population that had been receiving opiates in various forms for generations, and whose nervous systems were, in many cases, already primed for the escalation heroin represented. By 1914, heroin was among the drugs restricted by the Harrison Narcotic Act. By 1924, its manufacture was made illegal in the United States. The drug had gone from miracle to contraband in 26 years. What the prohibition achieved was a rearrangement, not an elimination. The chemistry had not changed. The demand had not changed. The supply simply moved. From pharmaceutical manufacturers operating under medical supervision to street-level distribution networks operating under no supervision at all, with no quality control, no consistent dosing, and no mechanism for warning users that the batch they had purchased was stronger or weaker, or adulterated with something the dealer had added to extend the supply. OxyContin was synthesized in Germany in 1916, during the period when heroin's problems were becoming apparent, and the pharmaceutical arms race was already producing its next generation of candidates. It was derived from the bane, one of the alkaloids in the opium poppy, and it was designed, again with complete sincerity, to retain the analgesic properties of morphine and heroin, while reducing the physical dependence they produced. It did not reduce the dependence. It became instead the molecule at the center of the most consequential pharmaceutical marketing campaign in American history. The story of OxyContin begins in the telling that matters most, not in a laboratory, but in a ballroom. It was 1996. Purdue Pharma, a Connecticut-based pharmaceutical company controlled by the Sackler family, had just received FDA approval for OxyContin, a controlled-release formulation of oxycodone that delivered the drug slowly over 12 hours rather than the 4 to 6 hours of immediate-release oxycodone preparations. The controlled release mechanism was the basis for Purdue's central marketing claim that because OxyContin released its oxycodone slowly, it was less prone to abuse and less likely to produce addiction than shorter-acting opioids. At the launch party, Richard Sackler, then a senior executive of Purdue Pharma, later its president, stood before the assembled guests and asked them to envision a natural disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane, a blizzard. The debut of OxyContin, he said, would be followed by a blizzard of prescriptions that would bury the competition. That sentence exists in the documentary record. It was not a metaphor that aged poorly. It was a forecast that proved accurate. The controlled release claim that the slow delivery of oxycodone made OxyContin less addictive than competing opioids was not supported by the clinical evidence available at the time of its approval. Purdue's own pre-approval trials had produced data suggesting that the 12-hour pain relief claim was unreliable in a significant proportion of patients. Many experienced breakthrough pain before the 12 hours had elapsed and required additional doses. The company knew this. Internal documents obtained in subsequent litigation showed that Purdue's sales representatives in 1997 and 1998 were recording in their notes that physicians had reported patients crushing and snorting OxyContin to defeat the controlled release mechanism and obtain the oxycodone immediately. The company did not withdraw the drug. It trained its sales force, one of the largest in the pharmaceutical industry, with more than 900 representatives, to tell physicians that OxyContin was less addictive than competing opioids. It paid physicians to attend dinner programs and weekend conferences where OxyContin was discussed. It sponsored educational materials distributed through medical schools and professional organizations. It funded patient advocacy groups that argued the undertreatment of chronic pain was a public health crisis requiring broader opioid prescribing. Physicians wrote more prescriptions. Pharmacies filled them. Patients received OxyContin for conditions that had previously been treated with much lower-tier interventions: back pain, arthritis, post-surgical recovery, dental pain. The same pattern the Civil War had established: a powerful opioid given broadly by institutions with legitimate authority to people who trusted those institutions was being repeated with different actors in different language through different distribution channels, producing the same physiological outcome in different American bodies. The soldiers had received morphine from military surgeons doing their best with the tools available. The chronic pain patients of the 1990s received OxyContin from family physicians doing what the pharmaceutical infrastructure had convinced them was evidence-based medicine. The intentions were, in both cases, entirely sincere. The results were, in both cases, a population whose nervous systems had been permanently rearranged by a compound those nervous systems now insisted upon. The drug spread from cancer wards and palliative care units into primary care offices and urgent care clinics and sports medicine practices. Prescription opioid sales in the United States quadrupled in the decade following OxyContin's launch. By 2001, OxyContin alone was generating more than $1 billion a year in revenue for Purdue Pharma. The Sackler family withdrew nearly $11 billion from the company in the years that followed into trusts and holding companies that subsequent litigation would spend years attempting to claw back. Between 1999 and 2021, 645,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. The number of overdose deaths involving opioids in 2021 was 10 times what it had been in 1999. Not double, not triple, 10 times. The Civil War had given soldiers morphine and called the result the soldier's disease. Purdue Pharma gave suburban America OxyContin and called the result a blizzard of prescriptions. The language was different. The architecture was the same. A powerful opioid distributed broadly by institutions that understood its effects and moved forward anyway. The numbers have the quality of statistics until you try to make them individual. 645,000 deaths is a number. It is also 645,000 people who had names and families and histories that did not include a plan to die from opioid overdose. Many of them had, at some point in their story, been handed a prescription by a physician they trusted for pain that was real, by a medical system that had been persuaded by a company that the prescription was safe. The distance between that moment and the mortality statistics is not the distance of moral failure. It is the distance of chemistry, of what the mu opioid receptor does when it is activated repeatedly at high intensity, of what the brain does when it remakes itself around a substance, of what happens when the substance is removed and the brain that remains is no longer the brain that existed before. When OxyContin's original formulation was finally reformulated in 2010 to make it more difficult to crush, a change that Purdue made only after years of litigation and regulatory pressure. Many of the patients who had been dependent on it moved to the next available substitute, not to the Tier 3 drugs they had been using before, to something cheaper and more available and already on the street, to heroin. And when the heroin supply became unreliable or expensive or simply insufficient for the tolerance that years of OxyContin had built in their nervous systems, they moved to what the street was offering next. What the illicit market had decided was the logical endpoint of a century of escalating opioid potency. What awaited them at the top of the ladder had no medical history in humans, no clinical trials, no physician who had ever recommended it for pain. It had been designed in a laboratory to sedate elephants. That is, Tier 5. Paul Janssen was 32 years old when he synthesized fentanyl. The year was 1960. He was a Belgian chemist working at the pharmaceutical company that bore his family name, and he had already by that point developed more clinically approved drugs than almost any other chemist alive. He would go on to develop 83 compounds that received regulatory approval, a number so improbable that it has the quality of a misprint. He was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most gifted pharmaceutical chemists of the 20th century. Fentanyl was simply one of many achievements. A synthetic opioid, built from scratch in a laboratory rather than extracted from the poppy, engineered to bind to the mu opioid receptor with extraordinary precision and extraordinary affinity. 100 times more potent than morphine, 50 times more potent than heroin. In the context of surgical anesthesia, the context for which it was primarily designed, this potency was not a problem. It was the point. Surgery requires a depth of analgesia that oral painkillers cannot reach, and that intravenous morphine reaches only imprecisely. The patient on the operating table cannot regulate their own pain experience. The anesthesiologist must do it for them, in real time, with drugs that work quickly, that can be titrated with precision, and that can be reversed rapidly if something goes wrong. Fentanyl in that environment is close to ideal. It acts within seconds of intravenous injection. Its effects are predictable and measurable. And crucially, in a hospital setting where naloxone, the opioid reversal agent, is immediately available, its risks can be managed. Fentanyl's legitimate medical applications expanded steadily after its introduction. Transdermal patches for cancer pain, delivering a steady dose through the skin over 72 hours, allowed patients with severe chronic pain to maintain stable analgesia without repeated injections or pills. Lozenges on applicator sticks for breakthrough pain, the sudden acute episodes that interrupt the background pain even of patients on long-acting opioids, gave cancer patients a fast-acting rescue medication. Intravenous drips in intensive care units allowed the management of pain and sedation in critically ill patients who could not communicate their discomfort. Fentanyl is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. In the hands of trained clinicians, in controlled environments with monitoring equipment and reversal agents nearby, it is one of the most valuable tools in modern pain management. Said in the sense, problem is not fentanyl in those environments. The problem is fentanyl everywhere else. To understand why the transition from hospital to street is so dangerous, it helps to understand what the hospital provides that the street does not. A trained clinician who knows the patient's weight, their opioid tolerance, their respiratory baseline, an IV line that can be stopped, a pulse oximeter alarming at the first drop in blood oxygen, naloxone immediately available, another person present. The entire environment designed around the possibility that the dose may need to be reversed. None of those conditions exist on a street corner. None of them exist in a bathroom or a bedroom where a person is alone. The drug is identical. The molecule does not change, but the infrastructure that makes fentanyl survivable in a hospital is entirely absent everywhere else. And that absence converts a controlled tool into something with no margin for error and no mechanism for rescue. The illicit market for fentanyl did not begin as a deliberate decision to introduce a more dangerous drug into the recreational opioid supply. It began as economics. Simple, brutal, pharmaceutical economics. A kilogram of heroin, purchased at source in the early years of the opioid crisis, could be acquired for approximately $6,000 and sold on the street for approximately $80,000. A reasonable margin, the kind of margin that had sustained the illicit heroin trade for decades and that made heroin distribution, for the organizations that ran it, a viable, if dangerous business. A kilogram of illicitly manufactured fentanyl, purchased from the chemical synthesis operations that had established themselves primarily in China and Mexico by the mid-2000s, could be acquired for approximately the same price as the heroin. It could be sold, cut into other drugs, pressed into pills, distributed through the same channels that had always moved the heroin, for approximately $1.6 million. Not 80,000. 1.6 million. The mathematics of that comparison require no elaboration. Fentanyl replaced heroin, not because anyone in the illicit supply chain decided the product should be more dangerous. It replaced heroin because it was a better business. 100 times more potent per gram meant 100 times more doses per kilogram, which meant, in the logic of the market, dramatically higher margins on the same capital investment. The drug trade had found its most efficient product, and it moved toward that product with the unsentimentality that markets always bring to efficiency. By 2016, fentanyl was present in more than half of all opioid overdose deaths across multiple states. By 2018, 31,335 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses. By 2023, that number had risen to 72,776. The trajectory is not a curve. It is a near vertical line on a graph of the kind that appears in mortality data when something has gone catastrophically, systemically wrong. There is a specific technical problem with fentanyl that explains why its death toll outpaces its prevalence in the drug supply. It does not mix. Fentanyl, when combined with other substances, heroin, cocaine, counterfeit pills pressed to resemble Xanax or Percocet, methamphetamine, does not distribute evenly through the mixture. It concentrates. It forms what toxicologists call hotspots, areas within a batch where the fentanyl has accumulated at concentrations dramatically higher than the average concentration of the batch. A pill pressed with a mixture that averages 2 milligrams of fentanyl per pill may contain, in the corners where the fentanyl has migrated and concentrated, 10 milligrams or 20. There is no way to identify which pill in the batch is the hot spot. There is no way, without laboratory testing, for the person who has purchased that pill to know whether what they are holding is a survivable dose or not. The therapeutic dose of fentanyl, the amount a trained anesthesiologist administers to induce surgical analgesia in a controlled setting, is measured in micrograms, millionths of a gram. The lethal dose in a person without opioid tolerance is estimated at around 2 milligrams. 2 milligrams is approximately equivalent to a few grains of table salt. It is invisible. It is imprecisely distributed through whatever it has been mixed with, and it causes death by respiratory depression, the progressive slowing of the breathing rate until the body simply stops breathing in a manner that is rapid, that is silent, and that, in many cases, gives the person experiencing it no time to call for help or to reach for the naloxone that might have saved them. There is a word for what the hotspot problem means in practice for a person who has purchased a pressed pill in the belief that they understand what they are taking. The word is lottery. Not in the colloquial sense of improbable good fortune, but in the literal probabilistic sense. Each use is a draw from a distribution whose parameters the user cannot know, in a concentration that has not been verified, where the consequences of the wrong outcome are not recoverable. Harm reduction organizations have responded by distributing fentanyl test strips, chemical indicators that detect fentanyl's presence in a sample before it is consumed. They work. They save lives. They also cannot detect carfentanil, which requires separate testing. And they cannot say how much fentanyl is present, only that it is present, which means a positive result requires either abstaining or accepting an unquantified risk. Asphyxiation. That is the mechanism. The mu opioid receptors in the brainstem that regulate the respiratory drive are occupied so completely by the fentanyl that the signal to breathe is suppressed. The body does not panic. It does not convulse. In many cases, the person simply becomes still, and then stiller, and then not breathing. The fentanyl, in its singular efficiency, has silenced the alarm so completely that the body does not register the emergency it is in. The DEA classification of fentanyl as a Schedule II controlled substance, the same category as morphine and oxycodone, indicating high potential for abuse and severe dependence, predates the illicit fentanyl crisis by decades. The drug was scheduled appropriately for its legitimate medical applications. What no scheduling decision could account for was the appearance of illicitly manufactured fentanyl as an adulterant in the broader drug supply, present in substances purchased by people who did not know it was there, in concentrations that varied unpredictably from purchase to purchase. And then, partway up the final rung of this ladder, chemistry did something that seemed, even to people who had spent careers studying opioid pharmacology, almost impossible to believe. It got worse. Carfentanil was first synthesized in 1974 by a team of chemists at Janssen Pharmaceutica, the same company founded by Paul Janssen, the same laboratory tradition that had produced fentanyl 14 years earlier. It is a structural analog of fentanyl. Take fentanyl's molecular architecture and substitute a specific chemical group for another, and you arrive at a compound with a receptor affinity so extreme that it exists for all practical purposes outside the range of human therapeutic use. Carfentanil is 10,000 times more potent than morphine, 100 times more potent than fentanyl, 50 times more potent than heroin. Those are numbers that resist comprehension until you try to translate them into physical quantities. A standard therapeutic dose of morphine for severe pain is around 10 milligrams. A dose of fentanyl sufficient to produce surgical anesthesia is around 100 micrograms, 1/10 of a milligram. A dose of carfentanil sufficient to kill a human being is estimated at approximately 20 micrograms, 20 millionths of a gram, less than a grain of table salt, invisible to the naked eye. undetectable by smell or appearance in a powder that has been mixed with other substances. Carfentanil has no approved medical use in humans. It was developed as a large animal veterinary anesthetic, specifically for the immobilization of elephants and other megafauna that require sedation for veterinary procedures, and that at several thousand kilograms of body weight require compounds of a potency that would be instantly fatal in any mammal of human scale. Its legitimate applications are narrow, conducted by trained wildlife veterinarians who work with antidotes immediately at hand, because even a small miscalculation in the carfentanil dose can produce respiratory depression requiring reversal within minutes. It appeared in the illicit drug supply in the United States in 2016. Almost immediately, the death toll in the states where it was detected began to move in ways that distinguished it from the fentanyl baseline that had already seemed catastrophic. Ohio reported nearly 400 carfentanil-involved deaths in the 6 months from July to December of 2016 alone. Florida reported more than 500 for the full year. The medical examiner community, which had spent the previous decade adapting to the fentanyl crisis and developing the specialized toxicological testing required to detect it in post-mortem samples, found itself confronted with a compound that required yet another layer of specialized testing to identify, and that was appearing in deaths that had initially seemed to be fentanyl overdoses, but were, on further analysis, something measurably worse. The logic by which carfentanil entered the illicit supply is the same logic that brought fentanyl there before it. The same economics, the same mathematics of potency per gram. A compound 100 times more potent than fentanyl is, in the arithmetic of the illicit market, a compound that can be diluted 100 times further while maintaining the same apparent effect. The margins are exponentially more favorable. The fact that the compound cannot be dosed accurately, cannot be distributed evenly through a mixture, cannot be detected without laboratory equipment, and kills human beings at concentrations measured in millionths of a gram is, in that arithmetic, someone else's problem. It is the user's problem. Specifically, it is the problem of the user who purchased what they believed was heroin or fentanyl or a counterfeit pharmaceutical, and who received instead something for which no dose exists that is both active and safe in a human body, without immediate medical supervision and reversal agents on hand. There is no recreational dose of carfentanil. There is only a dose that kills more slowly, and a dose that kills more quickly. The people who died from carfentanil in Ohio in 2016 were not, in most cases, people who knew they were taking carfentanil. They were people who purchased what they understood to be heroin or a counterfeit pharmaceutical, and who received instead a compound for which no amount of tolerance, no amount of experience with opioids could have meaningfully reduced the risk. Opioid tolerance provides some protection against fentanyl. It provides negligible protection against carfentanil at street concentrations. The compound is too potent, too unevenly distributed, for tolerance to serve as a meaningful buffer. The medical examiners processing those cases were working at the edge of what their testing protocols could detect, on deaths that had initially seemed to follow the fentanyl pattern, but that resolved, on closer analysis, into something the crisis had not yet produced. This is the top of the ladder. This is where the chemistry of pain relief, the chemistry that began with a woman chewing willow bark in the Mesopotamian sun 4,000 years ago, that continued through the alchemists and the physicians and the pharmaceutical chemists and the marketing departments and the congressional hearings and the patent applications. This is where that chemistry ends up, if you follow it far enough without asking the questions that should have been asked at every rung along the way. Not with a cure, not with the non-addictive substitute that everyone was always searching for, with a compound designed for elephants, killing human beings at doses too small to see. The macro loop, opened at the beginning of this long night, asked a question. What is the distance between the weakest painkiller on this list and the most lethal? What is the measurement that separates the willow tree from Carfentanil? The distance is not moral. It is not the distance between virtue and corruption, between the innocent and the guilty, between the careful and the reckless. It is a trajectory. 4,000 years of accumulated chemistry, each step taken in good faith by someone who believed, genuinely believed, that what they were making was the answer. The willow bark worked. Salicin worked better. Salicylic acid worked better still. Aspirin, laudanum, morphine, heroin, OxyContin, fentanyl. Each one was the answer, until it became the next question. The distance, if you must measure it, is the distance between a plant that a body could metabolize without consequence and a molecule so precisely targeted to the brain's pain receptors that it occupies them completely, silences the respiratory drive entirely, and leaves the body with nothing to do but stop. That is the distance. It is measured in milligrams, in receptor affinity, in the time it takes a brainstem to stop sending the signal to breathe. And it was traveled one step at a time. We have climbed the ladder. It took 4,000 years to build it, and we have climbed it tonight in something under 2 hours, which gives you some sense of the pace at which human ingenuity tends to outrun human wisdom. We began with a tree. We end with a powder invisible to the naked eye that can stop a human heart before the person carrying it has had time to understand what is happening. It is worth sitting with that distance for a moment, not to feel horror, though horror is a reasonable response, but to feel the specific shape of what we have described. Because the shape is not what it appears to be at first glance. At first glance, the history of painkillers looks like a story of failure, a story of mistakes compounded by mistakes, of hubris compounded by greed, of a civilization that kept reaching for a chemical solution to a problem that may not have a chemical solution, and that paid each time in ways it had not anticipated. And that reading is not wrong, but it is not the whole story. And the part it leaves out is, in some ways, the most important part. Almost nothing on the ladder we climbed tonight began as a drug of abuse. The willow bark was not abuse. The salicin was not abuse. Aspirin was not abuse. Laudanum was the medicine of its era, prescribed by physicians who were doing the best they could for patients who were suffering in ways that had very few other remedies. Morphine kept men alive on battlefields where the alternative was dying in unspeakable pain on frozen ground. Heroin was, for a decade, a medically endorsed improvement on morphine. OxyContin was prescribed to people in genuine chronic pain by physicians who had been given every institutional reason to believe it was safe. Fentanyl remains, in the right context, genuinely irreplaceable. The ladder was not built by evil. It was built by the very human desire to make suffering stop. That is the first thing the reckoning requires us to hold. That desire is not a weakness. It is not a moral failure. It is one of the most fundamental impulses in medicine, in caregiving, in every human relationship that involves watching another person hurt. Pain is a signal. It is the nervous system's report on what is happening to the body. Urgent, insistent, impossible to ignore by design. The signal exists because ignoring it would be dangerous. And yet the signal is also, at a certain intensity and duration, incompatible with functioning, with sleeping, with being present in one's own life. We built the ladder because the signal was real and the suffering it caused was real, and the desire to relieve that suffering was, and remains, entirely legitimate. The impulse to stop the pain is not where the story went wrong. What went wrong was something subtler and harder to legislate against, which was the recurring failure to ask the question that comes immediately after. And what happens next? What happens next when you give a soldier morphine for his wounds and then the war ends? What happens next when you prescribe laudanum for a nervous complaint that does not resolve? What happens next when you build a 12-hour controlled-release opioid and send 900 sales representatives to persuade general practitioners that it is less addictive than what came before? What happens next is not a mystery. It has never been a mystery. The body's response to repeated opioid stimulation has been observed and documented at every stage of this history. The addiction was not hiding. It was simply not the question anyone was being paid to ask. This is the second thing the reckoning requires, a reckoning with the unnamed. We have mentioned tonight the famous names: Coleridge and his laudanum, De Quincey and his confessions, Ada Lovelace and the prescription that accompanied her final years. These names exist in the historical record because these people were already recorded, already written about, already documented, already visible in ways that most people are not. Their addictions are known because their lives were known. The vast majority of the people on this ladder were never known at all. The Victorian woman in a Manchester mill town, taking laudanum for the headaches that came with 16-hour workdays in a room full of cotton dust. The soldier who came home from Gettysburg and spent 30 years managing the morphine dependency that had been administered to him in a field hospital before anyone had a word for what was happening to him. The chronic pain patient in Ohio in 2003 who was handed a prescription for OxyContin by a doctor who believed with complete sincerity that the 12-hour formulation made it safer than the alternatives. The person who transitioned from OxyContin to heroin to fentanyl along a path that each step of which was from the inside simply the continuation of trying to manage pain that had never gone away. None of these people chose addiction. Every single one of them chose relief. The distance between those two things, between choosing relief and arriving at addiction, is not a moral distance. It is a pharmacological one. It is the distance between the first dose and the second, between the second and the third, between the third and the morning, when the body no longer functions in the way it did before the medication began. That distance is crossed in different bodies at different speeds, for reasons that involve genetics and prior trauma, and the specific formulation of the drug and the context in which it was taken, and 100 other variables that no one, in the moment of handing over the prescription or the bottle or the dose, is measuring. The history of painkillers is, at its core, the history of people in pain, not the history of the compounds themselves, not the history of the pharmaceutical companies, not the history of the regulatory failures, though it is all of those things too. At its core, underneath all the chemistry and the marketing and the congressional testimony and the patent applications, it is the history of human beings whose bodies were sending them signals they could not bear, and of the long, expensive, sometimes catastrophic series of attempts by other human beings to give them some relief. That is not a story that resolves into a verdict. It does not end with a clear assignment of blame that, once assigned, closes the account. Some of the actors in this story behaved with genuine malice. The Sackler family's withdrawal of $11 billion, while the overdose numbers climbed, is not a story of good faith error. It is a story of people who knew what their product was doing and made a series of deliberate decisions about what to prioritize. That is real, and it deserves to be named as real. But most of the story is not that. Most of the story is good faith error at enormous scale. Physicians who prescribed what they had been given every reason to believe was safe. Pharmacists who dispensed what they had been given every reason to believe was appropriate. Regulators who approved what the available evidence, misread or incomplete, suggested was manageable. Researchers who drew conclusions from data that could not support them. And patients, always, everywhere, at every tier of the ladder. Patients who were simply trying to get through the day with less pain than they had woken up with. There is a particular quality of tragedy in large-scale good faith error that is distinct from the tragedy of deliberate harm. Deliberate harm produces anger, and the anger is appropriate, and the anger has somewhere to go. Good faith error at scale produces something harder to metabolize. It produces the recognition that the institutions we built to protect us operated for decades with incomplete information and structural incentives that did not align with patient welfare, and that the gap between their intentions and their outcomes was filled entirely with human suffering. That recognition does not resolve into a verdict. It does not produce a single actor to hold responsible for 645,000 deaths, because the 645,000 deaths were produced by a system, and systems do not stand in a courtroom. The pattern that recurs across every tier we have climbed tonight is simple enough to state in a single sentence. Medicine solved one problem by creating a slightly worse one, and then solved that one the same way, and then again, at escalating speed and escalating cost for 4,000 years. Salicylic acid solved the willow bark problem and destroyed stomachs. Aspirin solved the stomach problem and caused bleeding. Laudanum solved the acute pain problem and created the first mass addiction. Morphine solved the laudanum problem and produced the soldier's disease. Heroin was meant to solve the morphine problem and produced heroin addiction. OxyContin was meant to solve the short-acting opioid problem and produced the modern epidemic. And each time, the solution arrived with complete confidence, with institutional endorsement, with the best intentions of everyone involved. The confidence is the part worth sitting with as we prepare to rest, not as a cause for despair, but as a cause for a particular kind of attention. The confidence is always genuine. It is never performed. Bayer was not pretending to believe that heroin was safer than morphine in 1898. Purdue Pharma's sales representatives were not all knowingly lying about OxyContin's addiction potential. Most of them believed what they had been told. The confidence of each generation in its solution is one of the most consistent features of this entire 4,000-year story. And it is always outpaced, eventually, by the pharmacology. Where are we now? It is a question worth asking, even in a history, because history is not only about the past. The harm reduction movement, the collection of public health approaches that prioritize reducing the damage caused by drug use rather than insisting on abstinence as the only acceptable outcome, has, over the past 2 decades, produced some of the most effective interventions in the history of opioid crisis response. Naloxone, the opioid reversal drug, is now available without prescription in most American states. Fentanyl test strips, once classified as drug paraphernalia in many jurisdictions, have been legalized in the majority of states and are being distributed by public health organizations at scale. Medications for opioid use disorder, methadone and buprenorphine, are more widely available than they have ever been, and the evidence for their effectiveness is strong. These are not solutions to the underlying problem. They are the beginning of an honest answer to it. An acknowledgement, hard-won and long delayed, that the pharmacology does not bend to the force of moral disapproval, that the body does not recover because we have decided it should, and that the most effective thing medicine can do in the face of a problem it helped create is to meet people where they are rather than where we would prefer them to be. The shift from abstinence-only frameworks to harm reduction frameworks is not, in the view of the evidence, a lowering of standards. It is a raising of them, a willingness to measure success by lives preserved rather than by the tidiness of the outcomes we can point to. The ladder is still there. Fentanyl is still in the drug supply. Carfentanil is still appearing in post-mortem toxicology reports. Prescription opioids are still prescribed, more carefully now than they were in 2003, but still prescribed because the pain they treat is still real and the alternatives are still insufficient. The opioid crisis has not ended. It has changed shape. From prescription pills to heroin, to illicitly manufactured fentanyl, to fentanyl analogs, as it has changed shape at every previous transition in this history, the demand persisting through each rearrangement of the supply. But there is something now that did not exist at any previous point in this story. There is, finally, an accurate vocabulary for what the ladder is and what it does. There are clinical frameworks for understanding addiction as a physiological process rather than a moral failure. There are communities of people who have walked back down the ladder and are willing to describe, in precise and useful terms, what the descent required. There is, slowly and imperfectly, the beginning of an institutional willingness to ask the question that should have been asked at every rung. And what happens next? That is not closure. It is not resolution. 4,000 years of this particular history do not produce a clean ending, but it is, perhaps, a different kind of beginning, one in which the question is finally being asked before the next solution is deployed rather than after. Let us return one last time to the bottle. Brown glass, the size of a thumb. Flowers on the label, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The mother who held that bottle in 1883 was not reckless. She was not uninformed by the standards of her time. She was a person in a specific moment of history, doing what the institutions of her time told her was appropriate, trying to give her child relief from something that was making the child suffer. She was doing what every person in this history has done at every tier of the ladder, in every era. She was trying to make the pain stop. That impulse will not end. It should not end. It is the impulse that drove every discovery on this list, that built every laboratory, that persuaded every physician to hand over the prescription that either helped or harmed or did both simultaneously, depending on variables no one fully understood at the time. The question was never whether to try to stop the pain. The question was always what to ask before you reach for what stops it. 4,000 years later, We are still learning how to ask that question before it is too late to matter. Sleep well. You have earned it.